Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. I'm wearing my new Nigerian shirt. A Nigerian friend traveled to the continent, to the motherland, and she brought me back 4 shirts. So over the next 4 weeks, you will be seeing me showing off my Nigerian shirts. I really love African shirts. They connect me physically and spiritually to the motherland. So I want to welcome a few new patrons that just joined us over the last 3 weeks. I thank you, and I thank all the existing regular members of the African History Club. Today I want to speak on a contemporary issue. I want to talk about the coronavirus pandemic in Africa. And of course, some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that the numbers in Africa are very interesting when we talk about the infection rate and the death rates. So why don't we just get straight into it? So this is episode number 29. In the United States, as of today is now the 1st of April. The total infection stands at 30,500,000, and deaths, reported deaths, 552,000. In Africa, the total for the 54 countries comes to 4,206,512 infection, and the total deaths 112,522. And you should also note that the population in Africa is about 1.3 billion. So obviously if you go per capita wise, the numbers are even much lower relative to the United States in terms of the infection and the deaths. And the numbers are even further skewed in Africa. The bulk of the infections and the deaths are concentrated in South Africa. So South Africa has a total infection of 1.6 million infected, and the total deaths 52,788, accounting for almost half of the total deaths in Africa. So the numbers relatively, when compared to United States, of course, and other parts of the world, are encouraging, but at the same time, it's we can't go by that comparison, because what if the numbers were not that bad in the United States? So it should still be treated as an urgent pandemic, because as you know, and some of you may not know, that the African countries have a very weak medical infrastructure system. South Africa, ironically, has one of the best in terms of hospitals, clinics, availability, doctors, the facilities on the African continent. But at the same time, it has the highest numbers. But of course, there are many other challenges, such as access to vaccine. And that is going to be the biggest challenge for African countries. But what, to me, the most interesting angle that I want to talk about, and of course I'll get into the details of vaccination and all that, but the overall theme and story here is that when you have a pandemic like this, it exposes the dramatic weakness of African countries and African governments in terms of being able to take care of their citizens. And it's just quite appalling that now Africa is at the mercy of the outside world, the mercy of the West to get access to vaccines. And that's just unacceptable. There's not a single African country that does not have a well built, well equipped armed force. So it's an issue of prioritizing as well. Billions of dollars go into the armed forces to buy sophisticated weapons, tanks, jet fighters, pay generals, colonels, and all these soldiers. And the health care system and infrastructure are neglected. Education neglected. The training of scientists that should be at the forefront of research and developing vaccines neglected. So at the end of the day, it is exposing inherent weaknesses of many of these African governments and exposing the sense of the misguided priorities in Africa. And of course, we've seen that time and again. We saw it with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, when African countries were at the mercy of the rest of the world. They could not produce the medicines. They didn't have access to the patents. And while you could say it is unconscionable for the West and for other countries not to make these available to African countries, at the end of the day, you should ask yourself, the West enslaved Africans. The West colonized Africa. And you think their priority is going to be addressing the healthcare needs of Africans, whether it's HIV/AIDS, whether it's Ebola, and whether now today the coronavirus pandemic? You know, it's just preposterous for somebody to use that kind of logic, you know? So look at the importance of prioritizing. Look at Cuba, for example. Cuba has developed its own vaccines. When African countries, West African countries, suffered from the Ebola pandemic, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, these were the countries that suffered from the pandemic in 2014. Total infection was like 28,616, and total deaths 11,310. Tiny Cuba was once again at the forefront. Cuba sent more than 300 doctors and healthcare professionals and was successfully involved in fighting and controlling the Ebola pandemic. So why can't African countries and African leadership learn from the example of tiny Cuba with far lesser resources compared to African countries? Yes, there's the issue of Western domination and exploitation, but at the end of the day, there's some things that you can and need to do for yourself. And obviously it goes back to leadership. And when you have bad leadership, it won't happen. So yes, of course, we're always putting pressure on inept, selfish, greedy, corrupt African leaders who are often, by the way, sustained by the same Western countries that don't have the good interest of Africa at hand. So that is the challenge, fighting the people that sustain these kind of useless regimes, and then fighting the regimes. I have no excuse or no time for leaders that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on weapons to sustain themselves in power, while education, healthcare, the infrastructure, and the needs of the citizens are neglected. So Cuba has come to the rescue of Africa many times. Cuba came and fought in Angola and ensured that the MPLA formed the first government in Angola after the colonial power, Portugal, was defeated. Of course, Portugal and the West wanted to install puppet regimes under the FNLA or UNITA. But Cuba came and rescued the day. Cuba came back again and shed blood, sacrificed their blood in 1978 to defeat South Africa in Angola and began the dismantling of the apartheid regime in South Africa, led to the freedom of Nelson Mandela. Yes, that was in 1987, and Mandela was, of course, freed in 1990 after South Africa realized that they could be defeated on the battlefield. So this is actually not a digression. I'm talking about this because unless African countries come to the conclusion that they need to really have a radical approach where Africa's interest is number one. Cuba, of course, did it not out of choice. Ironically, the sanctions embargo, the illegal embargo against Cuba by the United States forced Cuba to do for self. Whereas you have African countries in this dependency relationship with the West that, these leaders that are sustained have no incentive to do the right thing by Africa and for African citizens. So of course, they need to be removed. I've been speaking to some journalists in Africa. I interviewed Sifelani Siko, who actually also writes columns for Black Star News, my media website, occasionally. And he told me that Zimbabwe and Namibia actually have been collaborating lately. So, for example, they've been acquiring vaccines from China and other equipment as well. So rather than Zimbabwe financing the entire cost of the air cargo, sending a plane there, they've been sharing the cost with Namibia. And these are the type of Pan-African approaches that we need. So one plane would go out there and get all the supplies, the medicines, come back, land in Zimbabwe, offload, and then continue on to nearby Namibia. And these are the kind of cost-sharing efforts that they need. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be only the coronavirus. First, you had the HIV/AIDS pandemic, you had Ebola, we're dealing with COVID-19 now. It's definitely going to be something else in the not so distant future. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to be able to produce your own medicines and your own vaccines. And there's no excuse for 54 countries not to be able to come together and say, even with our divided politics and our lack of Pan-Africanism that Kwame Nkrumah had advocated for as far back in the 1950s and 60s, even though we lack that spirit, there's some issues we need to galvanize around and have a Pan-African approach. And number one, when it comes to dealing with these recurrent pandemics, that should be a number one issue. Of course, there are many other issues: economic cooperation, military cooperation, so that you don't have a situation ever again where NATO can come and invade and destroy an African country, as with Libya in 2011. And of course, these are the things that we aspire toward, and eventually will happen when the crop of leadership improves in African countries. So that is the one aspect that I wanted to get out of the way first. Think about it. The World Health Organization has said that 90 million doses of vaccine will be made available to African countries by the end of the summer. We're talking about a continent of 1.3 billion people. Obviously, this is less than a drop in the ocean. And it's surprising because it shows a kind of warped mentality that these, the wealthier countries think, okay, we don't really have to worry about, people in Africa right now. Let's take care of ourselves. Let's take care of us in the United States and in Europe, as if this is the kind of disease. This is like almost a Trump mentality. And you see some of the Republican governors in this country as well saying, oh, my state is not doing that bad. This is a New York problem, so I can ease up and relax on all these protocols and regulations. What kind of thinking is that? I mean, if everyone is not ultimately vaccinated, nobody really is safe anywhere in the world. So how are you thinking that, yes, we'll make 90 million doses available for a continent of 1.3 billion people, and you think that is a solution? It is completely, preposterous, of course. But then once again, it brings us back to the begging syndrome, where Africa has to once again be at the mercy of the outside powers. So that is a general overview of the coronavirus pandemic in Africa. I mean, obviously, we also have the situation where political leadership have abused the disease. There's corruption. In Uganda, for example, the World Bank made $300 million available to fight the pandemic. I remember I actually wrote to the World Bank when the story first came out. There were two disbursements. There was the World Bank and the IMF. When I heard about the IMF one, which was actually even more than 300 billion, I think it was 500 or 491 million rather. And I said, you're giving a corrupt general, this dictator, all this money. What assurance do you have that the money is going to go into fighting the pandemic? And I actually got a response, which I published. They claimed that put in mechanisms to make sure this would not happen. And of course it happened. Millions of dollars embezzled by the dictator in Uganda, General Yoweri Museveni, and diverted toward his re-election campaign, the election which was very bloody, which he rigged, and is trying to swear himself again as president after 35 years in power. And then also you have in Ethiopia as well, where the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed postponed elections last year and precipitated a crisis because Tigray, that one zone, actually said this is constitutionally mandated that elections have to be held. So they had the regional elections, and that, of course, precipitated the conflict in November with the bloody war actually a war of aggression coming from the central government against the Tigray region. And I did a podcast on that a few weeks ago and discussing that there can be no military solution to this conflict. There's been a lot of targeting of civilians in this conflict by the Ethiopian National Army. There are many credible reports, women being raped being used as a weapon. So, and that also, was precipitated by the exploitation or abuse of using the COVID-19 pandemic as a pretext for political purposes. And I find that I want to comment also on Magufuli, the late John Pombe Magufuli, president of Tanzania, who died on March the 17th. Magufuli had just returned into office after October election, which was disputed by the opposition, claimed it was rigged. And that was the beginning of his second term. Magufuli was widely regarded as a coronavirus denier. He discouraged the use of face masks. He did not wear it himself. He had even said he was either going to do or had already come out with regulations that Tanzania was not to import any of the vaccines. He had said last year that the pandemic had actually disappeared in Tanzania. He said it could be addressed by prayer. Initially, he said there was this herbal concoction from Madagascar, which he claimed was effective in dealing with the pandemic. And at one point last year, I think it was in May, Tanzania stopped publishing the data. The last published data was about 500 infections and about 21 deaths. And then claimed that thereafter there was no more COVID, which of course people, it was widely reported very skeptically. It was not credible. And in fact, in recent weeks, the vice president of the autonomous island of Zanzibar, which is a part of Tanzania, died from the virus, from COVID-19. And his own cabinet secretary also died from COVID-19. So that is why when he disappeared from public February 27 and was not seen again, it was suspected that he had also actually come down with the virus. The government finally announced his death on March 17, saying it was a complication out of a heart ailment that he had had for years. And that obviously is true, but that does not mean that COVID-19 could not have, triggered it and been a factor as well in his death. But then, if you saw the funeral, the processions, it was astounding. You had tens of thousands of Tanzanians coming out to mourn Magufuli, running alongside his motorcade, just tens of thousands of people as far as the eye could see. And then at another gathering at a stadium, just thousands and thousands of people mourning John Pombe Magufuli, the late president. And why is that? Because he had revolutionized economic production in Tanzania over the short time he had in office. He just finished one term, 5 years. He started the second term and then he's dead. But in the little time that he had, he fought corruption. He would personally go to establishments sometimes himself to find out about what was going on. And thousands of public employees found to have been involved in bribe taking, embezzlement, were fired and prosecuted. That's number one, fighting corruption. He became known as the bulldozer for fighting corruption. And this resonated not only in Tanzania, but throughout Africa, actually. So there was a hashtag which was very trending at one point, saying, what would Magufuli do? And these are in different African countries when it came to dealing with issues of corruption. And then he also built thousands of miles of new roads in Tanzania. He built bridges. He built a new railway, thousands of miles of railways, because he really wanted to fulfill Tanzania's agenda for wanting self-reliance, which of course is something that the great Tanzanian president, the late Julius Nyerere, had done all his professional political career in Tanzania. And The economic output was growing dramatically, one of the fastest growing in Africa under Magufuli. And he also did one thing that he was actually advocating that all African countries need to do in terms of taking control of the resources, the mineral resources. So he went after one of the biggest foreign multinational companies and claimed that they had been undervaluing the output from a gold operation in Tanzania. And they changed the law saying if there's a dispute, it will not go to outside arbitration. It will be decided by the laws of Tanzania. And ended up fining that corporation billions of dollars, and they ended up settling for 300 million. And 100 million of those 300 million had already been paid. So they're being paid in batches, And he also discouraged the exports of raw materials. He wants it at least to be processed first and eventually used to manufacture products in Tanzania. So was he really a denier? Did he not believe that COVID-19 was real? That's not possible. He had a PhD in chemistry. So my own thought is that Magufuli made that decision and said, listen, and obviously I'm speculating, but it would seem reasonable. Well, this is not, one of those caricature of some of the African leaders we've had in the past with minimal education, who just stumbles into power or was installed by a foreign interest in power. No, this guy had a PhD in chemistry, so he knew that COVID was real. But he made the decision. People are going to be dying for a while until such a time that the vaccines are discovered and made available. But why should the economy also die in that process? So I feel he, just ignored it and pretended, that COVID had disappeared from Tanzania. It's ludicrous. It did not disappear. And a guy with a PhD knows that as well. But he said, rather than have people die and the economy also collapse, let people die until the vaccines become available, but let the economy live so that when the vaccines finally become available, people will then live, the ones who have not died, and they will be able to sustain themselves in a functioning economy. I think that's the decision he had made, the calculation he made from the very beginning. Now, does that mean I'm endorsing what he did? Of course not. I'm just giving a realistic assessment of what I think really happened. I don't believe a person with a PhD in chemistry would not be able to know that, you can't have thousands of people dying in the other African countries, the neighboring countries, in Kenya, and in Uganda, and in Rwanda, Burundi, all neighboring countries, and claim there's no COVID-19 in Tanzania when you share borders with most of these countries. So that is my presentation on the COVID pandemic in Africa. Of course, I'll do another update on this in a few weeks when the vaccines are being rolled out in most of the African countries. And I'll provide an update at that time. So thank you so much for all your support, patrons. I hope you find my presentations informative, and feel free to let other people know about it. Thank you. Stay strong. Be Pan-African and stay healthy. See you next time.